Hello everyone. So as I sat down to record this week's lecture video, I realized that I never even recorded a lecture video for last week. So my apologies. I had a very clear memory of recording and posting a lecture video that was not there. And the more I thought about it, the more it wasn't last week's. It was the week before last that I remembered doing it. So I sincerely apologize. I know how important it is to have your instructor present in the class as well as consistent. So the lecture videos aren't something that I just decide to do some weeks and not the others. I usually do them consistently. And I just happened to have, because of a very busy week, I had what is sometimes called a brain fart. So with that being said, if you find yourself in the same situation, it is a 7-week course and this is week 5 and you completely thought that one week was another and they're running together, and you may have missed an assignment, then feel free to contact me. I think you will find that I am a bit more flexible than you might originally assume, not just because I had a brain fart last week, but because it's just a really fast-paced course. And so let me know if you have any concerns, if anything's going on. I don't have to know your business, or you don't have to give me any details, but if this is about to be a crazy week, or you had a crazy week last week or something like that, in these 7-week courses, it just goes by way too fast to be able to miss an assignment. So reach out to me if you have had a similar week and we can work something out. But for this week, we move on to the module of human communication. And there are 4 chapter readings, but one of them really just outlines human communication in general. And the other 3 talk about rhetoric, they talk about persuasion, and they talk about interpersonal communication. So those are 3 aspects of the study of communication that we typically see organized in that way, especially when it comes to selecting a concentration. So we don't have you select a conversation in undergraduate, but if you do want to get on to a graduate career in communication, you then do have to typically choose a track. Even if it's not a formal track, you have to choose one of those for your thesis topic. So this week is really interesting if you want to continue your studies, because it's a good framework for thinking of the different facets of the study of communication. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to begin by talking about rhetoric. So when we focus on the topic of rhetoric, we really are taking the lead from looking at the ancient Greek study of philosophy. So if you find yourself in a rhetoric course, if you may have taken one already, but in graduate school, if you do plan to go on, if you find yourself in a rhetoric course, a lot of times it might feel like you're in a philosophy course. And I'll tell you, I did not take a rhetoric course in my undergraduate career. So when I was first in that course, I was in grad school, and I really was that girl at my laptop Googling the word rhetoric. Even though I knew what the word meant, it felt like I was in a philosophy class, and I was so confused. I thought rhetoric, to me, was the art of speaking and writing well. And so that's a very technical way of studying. But when I was sitting in this class, it really felt like we were studying philosophy, and I was so confused as to why we were talking about a semantic triangle. And I was just so lost. So I want to give you that heads up so that you're not in the same position as me. That's why the study of rhetoric can sometimes sound like philosophy, because it gets its roots from ancient Greek philosophy. But when we look at the study of rhetoric now, you really do look at, on page 233, the book says that the ancient Greeks understood rhetoric to be a pragmatic art situated in immediate need. So essentially, let's say we are studying rhetoric, the writing of someone, or the speech of someone, and it's really a response to an immediate need. And when you think about your public speaking class or your advanced public speaking class, and you're studying these great speeches of famous people or politicians, they had a reason for speaking. It's not like they were in a public speaking course and they drew a topic from a hat. There was a need. They were a leader and they had to respond to that immediate need. So the study of rhetoric is rooted in what fueled them to speak the way they did, to organize their message the way they did, the way that they choose words. It really is such an interesting field of communication to study, especially if you do like a linear type of progression and motivations. But the other thing that you want to keep in mind when you're studying rhetoric is that a truly rhetorical perspective means to not assume that, let me look at the book, to assume that rhetoric itself is not inherently good or bad. So if you're studying rhetoric, you're not thinking about, are they persuading for the good of the people or the bad of the people? You really have to set that aside and just look at the message itself. So once you have those things in your, as a framework or as a base to study rhetoric, then you can move forward and truly feel as though you have a clear perspective as to what you're studying. So if you really find yourself engaged when a politician is speaking, or you really like the art of studying past speeches, then rhetoric is going to be a really cool option for you. But it's not limited to that. If you're not into politics, but you're into, chapter 16, then don't feel bad. There's plenty more for you to study, and chapter 16 talks about that. Rhetoric is doing, so how you are approaching the way that you communicate. Rhetoric is being, so symbolic and symbolic approaches. So when I was talking about the semantic triangle, that's where that comes in. And then rhetoric is shaping, so ideological approaches. Those are all approaches to rhetoric. And then the chapter finalizes with rhetoric as seeing, so the visual turn in rhetorical studies. And so you're going to see that there is a ton of things that rhetoric covers. And so I want you to keep that in mind as you consider if you haven't chosen already, your final paper topic. If this is if chapter 16 was really intriguing to you, then you may want to focus on that as your final paper topic. The next chapter talks about persuasion, and I won't spend too much time on persuasion because we really do embed it into a lot of the discussions that we have in the field of communication, but I did want to point out a couple of things. So on page 245, the very first page of chapter 17, the second paragraph really gives a great example as to defining really important aspects in persuasion. And it talks about the concepts of three things: attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And so when we study persuasion, we're looking at changing one of those things. And when we study in communication, it's mostly using, our communication skills to change either the attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors without actually forcing them physically to do something. So when I teach public speaking, when we start talking about the persuasive speech, I say, okay, a good example is if I'm trying to persuade someone to walk through this door and enter the classroom, and they don't want to. Persuasion would be how I would get them to feel as though they should walk through that doorway without actually going behind them and pushing them through the doorway. And so the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because the definitions given on this page are really interesting. It says attitudes are evaluative tendencies, beliefs are assessments that something is the case or is not the case, and behavior refers to observable actions. And it gives a really great example. Let's say I like the Miami Dolphins. That expresses my attitudes towards the team. I think the Dolphins will go to the playoffs next year. That expresses a belief. This is something I think this is the case. But betting on the Dolphins going to the playoffs would be behavior. So once you can kind of get your framework for that, and I don't think that behavior is something that we ever need an example for, but it's the attitudes versus beliefs that it's really helpful to have that example. And so this chapter focuses on the different types of studies that have been done about persuasion. On page 248, it talks about message selection and generation. And so if you are considering doing your final paper over something like agenda setting theory, or advertisements even, this is also going to be a good chapter for you to not forget about, because you're going to get a lot of good theories and other research to include in the paper. So don't forget about the persuasion chapter as you're compiling your final paper. If you know that your final paper topic has something to do with persuasion, chapter 17 is a good place to refer to as well. And finally, chapter 18 is my personal favorite and my research interest, interpersonal communication, how we communicate with each other. And so this chapter gives you a lot of different areas in which we study interpersonal communication. I enjoy this topic simply because it has to also do with behaviors, and it has to do with culture. It has to do with so many different things that drive us to interact the way that we do. So we look at uncertainty on page 263, adapting interpersonally on page 264, message production, which could has some ties to rhetoric as well. And then relationship development. So I am really big on studying relationships and the relationship dynamics and how we communicate with them. And I got to be that way simply because I chose my thesis topic really young. And so that's what I was, most young people are interested in developing relationships and how those form, friendships and things like that. So that's just how I ended up there. And you'll find that your personal interests do lead you to your favorite topics in communication. But it even talks about mediated social interaction. And I had a really interesting observation this week that had to do with interpersonal communication and mediated social interaction. So when I was in college, it was a lot of open discussion. So I was a communication major and a political science minor. So there was a lot of the instructor at the front giving us discussion prompts, and we had to give our thoughts, give examples to support our ideas. And I always participated until I learned that it was just better to not say anything at all, because it was so easy to offend people or people to take things the wrong way, and then I would get worked up and it just wasn't any fun. So I just started to zip it until I got to grad school and didn't have a choice. But at that point it was a little bit more of a selective group. And so what I've noticed with my students throughout the years is that as the generations move on, they won't say anything because they already know, probably based on their interactions on social media, that if they say anything, they could get into an argument really quickly, so they just don't say anything at all. And so what I realized is, okay, if I want my students to be having a discussion, I need to have some type of mediation, coupling them together in smaller groups. One-on-one is usually better, and that's how I get my students to actually discuss a prompt. As innocent as that prompt might be, they are more likely to engage in a deeper discussion if it is just with one other person rather than with the entire classroom. So that's something interesting that I would like to, think about a little bit more. I'm not saying I would do an actual study on it, but it's just an observation that I had that reminded me why I chose interpersonal communication as my concentration in graduate school. And so as you read on through the chapter, it's going to give you a lot of different research areas in interpersonal communication. So if that's something that you think is interesting, I would say don't skip that chapter. Read through it so that you can see all of the different areas that interpersonal communication is studied and all of the areas that it affects. So I hope that this week's readings aren't too boring for you. I know that reading a textbook can sometimes be boring even when we don't want it to be, and this week's readings are really very general, but if you can approach it from the standpoint of here are the different facets of communication studies, then it gives you, like I said, a good framework for, okay, this is why I'm reading this. It seems like a really strange place to put these chapters in the middle, but it really is just looking at the different sections of communication studies, where they got their beginnings, some current and past research, and then future, ideas for future studies or future projects. So each chapter kind of follows that same flow. And like I said, if nothing else, they will at least give you a really great resource for your final paper. So a good exercise to do by yourself is to say, okay, here's the final paper topic that I'm leaning towards or have chosen, and which one of these does it fit into? And then once you've done that, looking at the chapter from that point of view kind of gives you a little bit more of a guided perspective as you read through chapters, what was it? Sorry, I went blank. Chapters 15 through 18. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. If anything's going on that you need help with or that you need an extension, if you come to me before the deadline, it's a whole lot easier to work around. So if you can see that the week is going to get away from you, reach out to me. But at any point in time, I want you to know that I'm here to support you. Many of you are about to graduate, and I don't want this class to stand in your way of finishing up your degree. And then for those of you that aren't graduating, same thing. I don't want this to stand in your way. It's that itchy time of the semester when it's about to be done, but it's still right in the middle of a lot of stressful, to-do lists. So reach out to me if you need anything, if you have any questions. Great job, Group 5, Week 5, and great job, Week 4. I'm constantly impressed with your ability to organize the information and give the class a really cool resource to look at. And the discussion prompts have been awesome. I always like coming up with those prompts because it's basically my decision on what I want you to focus on. So getting that from students has been really refreshing, I think. It's not coming from my brain anymore, it's coming from yours and what you would like the class to think about. So that's been great. Thank you everyone for your participation and for your willingness to learn and to review a lot of this information. I hope that this is going to serve as a really good capstone for you to kind of put a big bow around all of the things that you've learned in communication studies and to go forward and be very proud of your degree. So I will talk to you soon. Have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.